All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to start the program. I'd like to welcome everybody to Southern Connecticut State University for our forum today. It's called World War I, From New Haven to the World, What Happened and What Ifs. So it covers a lot of ground. Now, you don't hear a lot about World War I these days. It's sort of overshadowed in the news, on TV, even in books, by its successor, World War II. And you'll see all kinds of biographies about the main characters in World War II, from Franklin Delano Roosevelt to Winston Churchill, and on the other side, Adolf Hitler, certainly Joseph Stalin, and so forth. And you'll also see documentaries about Pearl Harbor. You'll see documentaries about the battle for Britain and the development of the atomic bomb. And even that esteemed historian, Archie Bunker, once referred to World War II as WW2, the big one. So you don't have a lot about World War I, even in the sitcoms from the 1970s. Now, there's no doubt that World War II played a critical role in the course of American and world history. Our rise to superpower status was undoubtedly, at least in part, a result of World War II and its immediate aftermath. But many historians agree that World War I basically set the table for World War II to happen, and also set in motion a chain of events that would change the scope, the landscape of world powers for a century to come. The argument goes something like, without World War I, there's no Treaty of Versailles. Without the Treaty of Versailles, there might not have been the rise of Adolf Hitler. Without the rise of Adolf Hitler, there might not have been a World War II, at least as we know that it occurred. So what role did World War I play in the course of history? How close did we come to not entering the war? And from what I understand, pretty close. And how might that have changed history? Well, this morning we're going to discover these and other questions about World War I. We're also going to explore Connecticut's role during World War I. You don't read about that very often, so we're going to explore that connection to the war. In fact, we have the woman who literally wrote the book on New Haven and World War I, so we have a local connection as well. We have a terrific group of speakers, and we'll introduce them as the program goes on. Normally at our forums, this is where I thank a whole list of people, but because we have such a jam-packed speaking program, I'm going to just sort of give a blanket thank you to everyone. The program was made possible in part by the journalism department under the direction of Chair Cindy Simoneau, as well as our department, the Office of Integrated Communications and Marketing under the direction of Patrick Dilger. I'll make one exception to the thank yous. I'll thank Bruce Kalk from the Office of the School of Arts and Sciences for all of his help in putting this together. Just a couple of quick housekeeping details. We have 2 tables in the lobby, one from our admissions office, so if you're looking to get some brochures, pamphlets, information about Southern, certainly feel free to go back later and talk to Alexis, who's our admissions rep, the director of our admissions department. We also have a representative from the Knights of Columbus. They have an exhibit in their museum, which is, from what I understand, is very nice, so they have some information about that back there as well. The bathrooms are located in the hallway. If you go back into the lobby and head that way, so take a left if you're going out through the doors, and on the left-hand side, you'll see the bathrooms. The emergency exits are located on each side, obviously at the back of the auditorium as well, and so I think that takes care of all little housekeeping details. So at this time, I would like to call upon our president, Dr. Joe Bertolino, to offer his remarks about today's program. And President Joe has been a whirlwind since he started here a little over a year ago, and we're glad to have him. It seems like he's everywhere. He tries to be anyway, and we certainly appreciate that he's here with us today and taking the time out of his busy schedule to be here. So at this point, I'll turn it over to President Joe.
Thank you, Joe. And welcome to Southern, everyone. I would especially like to welcome some of our students from the high schools that are here today. I think we have some students from the Sound School in New Haven. Are you here? Maybe not. They might be a little late. Well, there's no sound there at the Sound School. Okay, great. Newtown High School? That's as enthusiastic as you get? Okay. Well, welcome Newtown High School. West Haven?
There you go.
I'm sorry, was West Haven here? Okay, very good. Did we miss anyone? Okay, so we've got, let's try this again. So we've got Newtown. Very good. And we've got West Haven. Well, West Haven, okay. And then we have everyone else. It's good to see you. I understand we also have a group from the Canoe Brook Senior Center. Very good. Well, I really want to welcome all of you to Southern Connecticut State University. Thanks for a little bit of enthusiasm at 9:30 in the morning. I appreciate that. As you also know, Veterans Day is just around the corner. And if you are a veteran, would you mind standing or raising your hand? We would really appreciate that. Please, please.
That's us.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's recognize our veterans. Thank you very, very much for your service. We greatly appreciate that. So, as Joe indicated, today you're going to hear from a distinguished series of speakers about the history of World War I, particularly about the U.S. entry into the war. And what you may not know is that the U.S. almost did not enter the war. World War I was, at the time, considered to be the war that would end all wars. But history would prove otherwise. So this morning, you'll hear about what led the U.S. into war, and you'll also hear about the war from an international, a national, Connecticut, and New Haven perspective. And at the end of the program, you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions. Now, as you leave today, you're invited to take a look at the World War I style ambulance, which I believe is out front. It's actually pretty cool. So as you leave here today, take a look. I think you'll enjoy seeing that and learning more about it. And as Joe pointed out, the students in the community here know me as President Joe. I'm pretty informal. So I would really like to extend an invitation to all of you to come and visit us again. Come and visit Southern anytime. I'd especially like to invite the high school students in the audience to please spend the day with us as my guest. I'd like you to come, explore Southern. I think you'd be pleasantly surprised by what we have here, what we do here. It's a pretty great place, if I have to say so myself, and I think you'd enjoy it. So please come and visit us. Please explore Southern, again, as my guest. And I promise you, you will not be disappointed by what you see and what you learn. So with that, again, I want to welcome you to Southern Connecticut State University and enjoy the forum, okay? Thanks so much.
Thank you, President Joe. So at this time, we would like to call upon our first speaker, Christine Pitsley, who's a project manager for the Connecticut State Library, who has overseen the project called Remembering World War I, Sharing History and Preserving Memories, that project. Now, Southern students, and in particular the Southern journalism students, have been involved very heavily with that project, and Christine has been working with our students for, how long, Christine? For the last 3 years, yeah. It's quite the undertaking. And so Christine may have a word or two to talk about that and a couple of other things as well. So Christine?
Thank you. So as he said, I am the project director for not only the Remembering World War I project at the Connecticut State Library, but several other initiatives that we've undertaken here in the state. I am the chair of the Connecticut World War I Centennial Committee, as well as the liaison to the National the United States World War I Centennial Commission. It has been incredible because it's been a journey where I've gotten to learn about what Connecticut was doing during World War I. And let me tell you, Connecticut was awesome during the war. We played a role that was really outsized compared to the rest of the states in our country. This is the State Library. This is a group of draftees mustered in front of the State Library, which was the Department of War Records. In 1919, the General Assembly designated the State Library the holder of all military records relating to World War I and World War II. We have one of the largest collections of materials in the country pertaining to state activity in World War I. Connecticut's munitions industry, that's the folks that were making the guns and ammunition, was active in the war starting in 1914. So our economy, while the rest of the country was in recession, our economy was humming along. More than 50% of the small arms munitions made for the United States were made right here in Connecticut. In Bridgeport alone, 1.5 billion shells of various sizes and 2 billion 36 shells were manufactured in Bridgeport alone in 1918. So that tells you a little bit about how important that aspect of Connecticut was during the war. Our Council of Defense, which was kind of the branch of government that orchestrated all of the activities in the war, was also one of the most active and well-organized in the entire country. And we got mentions all over the place in national media at the time. So, building on that, we created this Remembering World War I project. And like Joe said, some of the students from Southern have been working on this project. I have a couple students who I hope are out here who have been working for me on the project. And what this is we are going out into communities around the state and inviting people to bring us their World War I stuff. People come in with things like that helmet, or this photograph, which is a bunch of New Haven guys. We record the stories about them. That's what our students do. And then we photograph or scan whatever they bring in. And all of this is going onto a new website where we'll be able to share with you guys, with students, local stories so you can learn about the war from your own communities. We were in Monroe earlier this year, so we have some stories from the Newtown, Monroe area. We haven't been to West Haven yet, but we've got lots of stories from New Haven. One of my favorites are the diaries that people bring in, because they really show a firsthand look at what boys your age were doing during the war. Another project that we run is Over the Top, the Hartford Courant Reports on the Great War. This is a Twitter project that tweets out the front page of the Hartford Courant and assorted articles every day. As you can see, some of them are kind of boring, some are kind of fun. But if you want to follow it, we're at CT in WW1 or hashtag OTTHC. We've also brought that into Instagram. We hold the archives of the Hartford Courant from the war years, their photo archives. So we find photos that were published in the paper and we get to show them off. Like Miss Mary Hart, who was the first gate tender in Hartford, first woman gate tender. And the first day on her job, 5 different men came and took her stop sign from her and told her to go home. And she got upset with that, and if her boss hadn't been there, she told the reporter she would have biffed them all on the nose. We're also working with museums around the state. This, on the left-hand side, is a panel from a new exhibit that just opened at the New Haven Museum on Wednesday. It's a graphic arts exhibit, and the artist who did this worked recently with Stanley, and it's a great look. It's a great different look at World War I. I'm going to finish up by saying we have a list of events on our website, which is ctinworldwar1.org. We have a list of collections and photos, and this is kind of the clearinghouse for the state of Connecticut. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christine. And I believe the Sound School, or is that you guys coming in? All right. Welcome, Sound School. All right. At this time, as President Joe mentioned before, we have the World War I ambulance out in the front of the auditorium, or outside the auditorium. And with us today, we have Mr. George King, who is the executive director of the Ambulance 255 project, which is involved in these kinds of restorations. He's also a historian and an author. And later, during the Q&A, we'll have Mr. Jeff Klinger, who'll be joining, well, he's up on stage now, but he'll be joining the Q&A portion. If you have any questions about the ambulances and the medical aspects of the war. He has a lifelong fascination with military medical subjects, especially about World War I. He's also a former vice president at Genzyme Corporation with responsibilities in infectious diseases, research and development operations, and in the Neglected Diseases Initiative. So again, if you have a chance later to check out the ambulance, we would certainly invite you to do so. So at this time, I'd like to turn over the mic to Mr. George King.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today with Dr. Klinger, my colleague in the Ambulance 255 project. And I just want to give you a quick thumbnail sketch of what it's all about. Out front is a 1916 Model T Ford, which represents 1,200 ambulances that were donated by Americans and driven by American volunteers during the first 3 years of World War I. In other words, before the United States entered the war. These drivers paid their own way over to France, paid for their own uniforms, and succeeded in evacuating 500,000 French wounded in those 3 years. 77% of the volunteers were college students or recent graduates. The average age was 22, and I have found diaries of drivers that were as young as 17. Who's 17? Nobody. Nobody's 17 in here.
In the audience.
Over there. There we go. Okay, one old 17-year-old down there. So people the same age as you were out driving to the front lines to evacuate wounded. We are going to provide answers, hopefully, to your questions. This is what Jeff and I enjoy the most, so I won't go into any great detail except talk for a moment about the connection between Connecticut and the volunteer ambulance service. There were 56 drivers from Connecticut that volunteered, and additionally there were 202 drivers from Yale, which also represent quite an overlap of Connecticut residents. There were ambulance drivers from all 48 states, plus the territory of Hawaii. So it was a pretty extensive program, and it speaks to the volunteerism, that sense of need to help our fellow people in all parts of the world when things are going exceptionally bad. So the project, Ambulance 255 project goal is to encourage volunteerism among young people and hopefully get them to think about entering some service, some volunteer organization in their communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. King. And now we'd like to call upon our provost, Dr. Robert Prezant, to come up and introduce our keynote speaker. Now, Dr. Prezant started with us over the summer, and he's already made a very positive impact on the university, on the academic side of the house in particular, and we're very happy to have him with us today. So, Dr. Prezant.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you to all of our distinguished speakers who are here today to explore this really very complex subject of World War I. A little later in the program, we're going to be talking more about the state and the New Haven connection of the war, something you've heard a little bit about so far. But right now, we're going to be exploring the war from a national and an international perspective. As many of you know, and as you've already heard this morning, the U.S. was officially neutral in the war for quite some time. It wasn't until 1917, about 18 months before the end of the war, that the United States actually declared war and joined the Allies in the fight against the Central Powers, and that was after Wilson essentially won re-election by promising to keep us out of the war. So things changed pretty quickly in politics and global affairs. That mind change by President Wilson and Congress reflects a decision that would have ramifications for the rest of the 20th century. While the war ended almost 100 years ago, historians continue to debate how it affected the course of American and world history. But it is a fascinating part of history that has perhaps been overshadowed by World War II, the Cold War, and many historical developments that occurred in the second half of the 20th century. With us today is a leading military historian who has studied World War I, as well as the Treaty of Versailles. That's the peace treaty that officially ended the war. Dr. Michael Nyberg can tell us not only what happened, but intriguingly, how history might have been different if the United States had chosen to stay out of that war. Dr. Nyberg is a professor of history and chair of war studies in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. He is the author of a book published last fall by Oxford University Press called Path to War: How the First World War Created Modern America. Dr. Nyberg is also the author of, among several other books, Dance of the Furies: Europe and the Outbreak of World War I, a book that the Wall Street Journal called one of the 5 best books ever written about World War I. He holds a PhD from Carnegie Mellon University, and you might have seen him or heard him after multiple interviews on C-SPAN with the New York Times, the LA Times, the Wall Street Journal, Newsday, PBS, and many other media organizations. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning's forum, Dr. Michael Nyberg.
Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out, especially for the high school students. I have 2 high schoolers myself. I can't imagine them coming to an event like this happily, so I'm glad that you're here. The end of the First World War is a really interesting case study of a couple of things. It's an interesting case study in the way that people set up expectations for peace and how those expectations fall apart. It's also an interesting case study of how it can move a society, and the society I'm going to talk about here is the United States, from a general attitude of being kind of on the outside of international affairs to being fully engaged in the inside of international affairs. And this painting is an example of at least that first theme. This is done by a man named Stuyvesant Van Veen. He's a New Yorker. He painted this in 1932, and you can kind of get a sense of what he thought the peace process at the end of the First World War had done. If you look carefully, it says war to end war. Those words literally become the bullets feeding the machine guns and the rivers of blood that come from the wars that came after the First World War, filling the area where the speakers are speaking. It's a reminder that for a lot of people, the First World War did not end the violence in Europe, and for a lot of people, the First World War created violence in Europe as several successor wars broke out in the 1920s and 1930s, and then, as the provost mentioned, set the stage, laid the groundwork for the Second World War, which is to come. Now, Joe gave me, can I have the next slide, please? Joe gave me just 30 minutes to tell you the entire impact of the First World War on the United States. So what I'm going to do is do it by introducing you to 2 people. And the first one that I want to introduce you to is someone you've probably never heard of, a professor by the name of William Westerman, an historian. He looks like a mild-mannered professor in that picture, doesn't he? In the summer of 1917, he was a professor at the University of Wisconsin with an expertise in reading Egyptian papyrus scrolls, a subject that could not possibly be further from the First World War. In the summer of 1917, President Woodrow Wilson asked him and some other academics to join a group called the Inquiry. This is a group that was, could I have the next slide, please? There's Westerman in the top row there. This was a group that was supposed to advise President Wilson on what the United States ought to be thinking about as it put together ideas for the post-war world and what position the United States should take on a variety of complicated issues. And just yesterday, the archives, the papers of this group are here at Yale. So just yesterday, I was looking through some of the papers and some of the beautiful maps that this group put together to try to help educate Woodrow Wilson. On December 11th, 1919, William Westerman, seen there in the box, this guy who had been studying papyrus scrolls, Egyptian papyrus scrolls, finds himself in a meeting where the British and the Americans are going to decide whether the city of Istanbul is going to go to Turkey or go to Greece in the post-war world. A momentous decision. This is a strategically, unbelievably important city that both Turkey and Greece wanted. And here's William Westerman up there in the box involved in this decision. And this to me is an interesting symbol of what's happening to the United States as we go from more or less worrying about our own papyrus scrolls on all kinds of levels to being involved in all of these decisions. Now, at this meeting in December of 1919, a British diplomat told Westerman that Great Britain couldn't do it anymore because Great Britain, quote, could not develop any more backwards people. We have more than enough, end quote. Thus, the United States was going to have to come in and do some of the work. Now, Westerman was in a weird position. The United States didn't declare war on the Ottoman Empire, and the United States knew that it wasn't bound by any agreements that the great powers had signed. Nevertheless, there he is, having to make this critical decision. And more importantly, men like Westerman and the men in this photograph didn't exactly know what President Wilson wanted them to do. Westerman wrote in his diary, "No one knows just what is in the president's mind beyond vague phrases and beautiful ideas." Could I have the next slide, please? This is one of those vague phrases and beautiful ideas. Most of you, I hope, know about Woodrow Wilson's statement called the 14 Points, which he made in January of 1918. This is point 12 of the 14 points, promising that the Turkish portion of the Ottoman Empire should be assured a secure sovereignty. Another beautiful phrase, beautiful idea, but very difficult to put in practice. So why is the United States getting involved in this? Why is the United States finding itself involved in a dispute like how to put back the Ottoman Empire? I think there are three reasons that are really important for us to at least talk about. The first is, of course, the way that the other European powers had lost so much strength as a result of the First World War. Britain and France come out of the First World War nominally the winners of the First World War, but they are themselves aware of just how much weaker they are. Winston Churchill, who was one of the senior British advisors in the First World War, cabinet members in the First World War, later the Prime Minister of Great Britain in the Second World War, in 1919 he wrote, "One more such victory and the British Empire is dead." In other words, meaning that victory and defeat are looking almost alike. Second, Woodrow Wilson had made statements like this one, universalist, grand statements, that the United States was fighting the First World War not for the United States to add pieces of territory, not for the United States to get richer, but to do the right thing and to guarantee people freedom and security and self-determination. And the more of these grand ideas that Wilson made, the harder it was for the United States in the post-war world to move back away from them. And the third, as many of you I hope know, at about the same time, the Soviet Union came into being. Russia had a revolution. And the leaders of the Soviet Union had their own anti-imperial message. They had their own vision for the world that Woodrow Wilson was trying to undercut. Therefore, the United States, whether it wanted itself to or not, found itself deeply involved in the crises that the First World War had exposed. Could I have the next one, please? This is one of those crises. If you don't know about this, you should, because it's a decision made in 1916 that is still affecting your life. In 1916, British, French, and originally Russian diplomats sat down and made a couple of decisions. They decided that the Ottoman Empire, which had been in existence since the 15th century, was going to go away at the end of the First World War, and they had to figure out what they were going to do about that. What should the Middle East look like once the Ottoman Empire came apart? And in 1916, the British and French cut this deal. They took the Ottoman Empire, and as you can see, they literally took a map and drew with crayons. The part that was in blue would go to France. That is what we today call Syria and Lebanon and parts of southern Turkey. The British would get the area in pink. It's roughly what today is the country of Iraq. The area in B, Britain wouldn't take over, but Britain would control. The area under A, which is most of the rest of Syria, France would control, and then you can see there's a little yellow square there. That's the area they decided to call Palestine, and they would figure out what to do with that later. Right? A critically important decision. As some of you might know, ISIS, this group in the Middle East right now, they literally take bulldozers and drive over these lines to demonstrate their opposition to it. This is something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement that was done in secret. The United States had no part in negotiating it, and in fact, the Americans only found out about it when the Russian revolutionaries discovered it in the archives in Moscow and decided to publish it. So when the Americans saw the Sykes-Picot Agreement, they were furious. A, because it had been done without their consultation, and B, because it looked to the Americans like the absolute worst way to make decisions like this, just drawing lines on a map and not consulting the people who lived there. So the United States knew it was now in a dilemma. It could do one of two things. Either the United States could agree that the British and French could do this, in which case everything Woodrow Wilson had said would be rendered absolutely null and void, or the United States could itself jump into this problem and take an active role in trying to figure out what the post-Ottoman Middle East was going to look like. Neither one is a particularly attractive idea. Can I have the next slide, please? This is the second guy I want to introduce you to. This is Tasker Howard Bliss, an American general, a four-star general, very senior American military official, the second highest ranking American officer in the U.S. Army, a really interesting guy. When he was stressed out, he used to pour himself a glass of whiskey and read Livy and Thucydides in the original Latin and Greek. This is a really, really smart guy. The story was he could write in Latin with one hand and Greek in the other, which is an incredible thing. Westerman, the man I showed you earlier, called Tasker Bliss the ablest man in Europe and the one peace commissioner who will really study and study hard to make himself acquainted with what he must know. Now, he was less optimistic about what American military power could do. He thought that there was nothing about the Middle East that should draw the United States into it. Now, he didn't yet know, nobody yet knew, about the vast amounts of oil that were in the Middle East. Even in 1919, however, he understood that the United States was in a really tough position. It could either support British and French imperialism, it could get involved, or it could step away. And no matter which one of those things the United States did, it would come with a tremendous risk. And this is what he wrote to his wife. When it is all said and done, the United States will find that the European allies have gotten or taken for themselves every oil well and gold mine that there may be in Asiatic Turkey, and we will be asked to take a mandate, meaning to take control over, whatever pile of rocks and heap of sand may be left. I hope that we will have sense enough to keep out of it altogether. And this is an interesting theme that comes through the First World War and into the Second World War, where it is often senior military people who are telling the civilians, hey, don't get involved in this conflict. This isn't really our fight. Don't do this. Could I have the next slide, please? This is an interesting bunch of guys. Some of you may know the man, I guess, two from the right, the guy in the British uniform and the Arab headdress. This is a man named Thomas Edward Lawrence. He is sometimes called Lawrence of Arabia. He's a British officer who spoke Arabic and understood the Middle East. And in 1916, the British sent him to the Middle East to work with the man in the foreground of this picture, a man named Emir Faisal, to lead a revolt of the Arab people against the Ottoman Empire. And the deal was that if the Arabs did this, the British would promise the Arabs control over a wide part of the Middle East when the war was over. Now, the United States isn't really sure that it wants to do that either. This is them at the Paris Peace Conference trying to push their ideas forward. Faisal believed that what the British had done was to promise him that he would control most of the Middle East. Now, as you can probably guess, this now runs in direct conflict to the Sykes-Picot map that I just showed you. This is a decision that the United States now has to figure out what it wants to do. The United States now knows that the British have made two different promises. In fact, they've made three. The Sykes-Picot promise, where they get to split the Middle East with the French, the promises they made to Hussein, and they also made a promise to a group of British Jews in something called the Balfour Declaration that Palestine could become a homeland for the Jewish people. It's a mess, and the Americans aren't sure what they want to do about it. Can I have the next slide, please? This is what Bliss wrote about speaking specifically about Syria. He says, it seems that certain promises were made to the Arabs, and in the early days of the war, and now, he wrote sarcastically, they are so unkind as to insist on these promises being fulfilled. The consequence is a grand triangular row, which he meant a fight between the Syrians, the British, and the French, with insistence on the part of the Arabs that the matter be arbitrated by the United States. In other words, the Arabs are looking at the United States to be a fair, neutral arbiter to come in to make the decision. I myself have declared that I would not touch the question, even with a pole long enough to reach from here to Syria, unless I were positively ordered to do so by my government. Bliss poetically described the Ottoman Empire to his wife as a beautiful necklace of colored beads, and that the chain of the necklace, the cord of the necklace, was going to break. It had broken, which meant that the beads were going to fall all over the place and scatter along the floor. What should the United States do? Should it be that kind of neutral arbiter? Should the United States step in and make a decision about the future of the Middle East? Or ought it, as Bliss thought the United States should, get away from it as far as they possibly could? I think if Tasker Bliss were alive 100 years later, he would not be surprised that the United States is still involved in the Middle East as a result of the decisions that were made a century ago. And I certainly don't think he'd be surprised to find out that it is now an even more dangerous place than it was when Bliss was trying to deal with it. Now, the problem for Bliss is that he can't get any of Woodrow Wilson's time. Wilson didn't want to talk to him, so he had a very difficult time getting his ideas into Wilson's head. Could I have the next slide, please? Meanwhile, Emir Faisal is telling people like Westerman, we got to get the United States involved in this. You guys are the best hope for the Middle East. As the United States is trying to make this decision, that blue area, that Syria and Lebanon that the French are going to create, after World War I, the French start sending troops in to colonize it. The French had argued that it was really French anyway, that the people in that region really want French support. They're doing this on the argument that there are a lot of Catholics that live in that area, and they're doing it on the basis of a lot of French educational institutions that had been set up in Syria. Faisal, however, said he had not freed Syria to make it French. He was now ready to let the blood run out of his body to free it from the French. In other words, I'm willing to fight a war against the French to keep them from coming into Syria. What Faisal wanted was for the United States to back him as the ruler of a kind of United States of the Middle East, with himself as the great George Washington of the Middle East. And he pitched this idea to Westerman, who said, ironically in French, voila, great is Lawrence and great is Faisal. I am a convert. In other words, the United States should back the creation of Faisal as the king of some wider Middle Eastern political entity. At the same time, Westerman didn't think the Arabs were ready to govern themselves. He said the Arabs were, quote, like children, pleased at notice, vain and superficial. So the United States would have to be involved. It would have to back this new political entity. The United States was going to have to involve itself in what was going on in the Middle East. Now, this is really, really complicated. On the one hand, a lot of Americans, like Westerman, think that the United States is pretty well placed to do this. According to Westerman's way of thinking, we're not imperialistic like the British and French. We don't want to carve up the Middle East. We want to help the people in the Middle East to get democracy, to get freedom, to get all the things that Woodrow Wilson had promised. On the other hand, nobody in the United States military likes the idea of sending American troops to the Middle East, especially if the French are going to start fighting the Syrians. The last thing the Americans want is to get in between those two things. Wilson also believed that America's relationship with France was more important than its relationship with the Arabs. Therefore, to take the Arab side against France would put the United States in a really, really bad position. So how do you get out of a mess like that one? Well, the United States got lucky. Can I have the next slide, please? British diplomats came up with the idea that a fact-finding mission should go to Syria and ask the Syrians what they wanted. Now, this didn't seem like a radical idea, but it was at the time. And the French were furious about it, in part because they knew that very few Syrians were going to say, yes, we want the French army here, and in part because they thought, if you're going to send a delegation to Syria to ask the Syrians if they want the French, you should send a group to Mesopotamia to ask the Arabs there if they want the British. Now, it went through anyway, this commission. The British were happy about it, the French were furious about it, and Faisal, who was Muslim, was so happy about it that he drank his first glass of champagne. Now, while all this was going on, the war in Syria continued to go on, and this is the war that is continuing to fuel and to create tensions in Syria today. What France decided to do was to take the mostly Christian parts of Syria and break it off as a separate country called Lebanon. And as some of you may know, the current civil war in Syria is being fought in part because the Syrian government does not recognize that separation of Lebanon from the rest of Syria. The Syrians also claimed until a few years ago that what is now Israel also belonged to Greater Syria. It also meant that the four ethnic groups inside Syria, the Christians, the Druze, the Sunnis, and the Shia, each took sides either with or against the French. The current government that is in Syria right now is part of a group called the Alawites that allied with the French. So the great mess that's going on inside the Middle East right now dates directly to the First World War. And you can see what Westerman wrote here. The net result in Syria, he wrote, this is 1919, is another bit of poison which will rot the Near East until the distant day when the Arabs and all the East shall definitely discard the unjustified assumption of Westerners embodied in the formula of white man's burden. And Westerman predicted that the more the West involved itself in the Middle East, the greater the risk of a rise of Islamic fundamentalism. Now, you still had to figure out what to do with Faisal. Now, he was originally from Arabia. He wanted, if nothing else, to control Arabia, and the British instead double-crossed him. The British instead gave Arabia to the rival family to his, the Sauds, which is why it is today known as Saudi Arabia. Faisal, they decided to send to the new country of Iraq that they were going to create, out of one Kurdish province, one Sunni province, and one Shia province. They lumped those three mutually antagonistic groups together. A woman named Gertrude Bell drew the original map. They called the new country Iraq, a place Faisal had never been. They sent him there. They had a plebiscite that said that 99.8% of Iraqis wanted him as their king. I'm sure it was a fair and free election. And he became King Faisal I of Iraq. Faisal's brother, Abdullah, they gave as the king of the new kingdom of Transjordan. His grandson is the current king of Jordan. So the borders that we get in the Middle East, the structure of government we have in the Middle East, comes directly out of all this conflict in the First World War. The Saudis, even though the British sided with them and gave them control of Arabia, nevertheless didn't trust the British. They too began to reach out to the United States. And in 1945, just to carry the story a little bit further, when President Franklin Roosevelt was coming back from the Yalta Conference, even though he was a very, very sick man and would die within a couple of weeks, he took the time to go to Egypt and meet with the king of Saudi Arabia in order to cement a U.S.-Saudi alliance, a U.S.-Saudi deal, in which the United States would protect Saudi Arabia in exchange for control of Saudi oil. It's the main reason that the U.S.-Saudi connection remains strong throughout the decades. Syria, of course, remains that bit of poison that Westerman referred to, with no easy answer in sight for the United States or for the world community. And it's important to recognize the way that these things have deep historical roots. Any problem that has historical roots that go back a century or more, you can guarantee is not going to be solved particularly easily. Next slide, please. Now, the United States didn't quite step aside from the Middle East, even though this British commission had come in. President Wilson ordered the creation of something that became known as the King-Crane Commission after the two men who were the two prominent figures in it. One of them was the president of Oberlin College, which is where the papers of this commission are today. And they wrote a report that went to President Wilson in 1919. It came just before President Wilson had this massive stroke that incapacitated him. So historians don't believe that Wilson himself ever read the report, and the results remained classified until 1922. But the report made four major points. One, it said that the Middle East was not ready for self-determination. That means the Arabs themselves are not yet ready to govern themselves, meaning that somebody, either the United States, the British, or the French, would have to come in and govern for them. And what they did at the end of World War I is they created something called the Mandate System, where the British and French divided the Middle East roughly along that Sykes-Picot map, with the French getting Syria and Lebanon, the British getting what we today call Iraq, Jordan, and they got Palestine. And the British and French would rule those parts of the world until the British and French determined that they were ready to govern themselves. A very complicated decision that left a lot of nasty, poisonous legacies into the Middle East today. Second, in 1919 at any rate, the King-Crane Commission said the United States should not support the creation of a Jewish homeland in the Middle East. The United States should under no circumstances support that decision, and that will be American policy until the end of the Second World War, when, of course, the context is different because of the Holocaust. Palestine instead should go into what they called a greater Syria, and it should be the United States, not the French, who are the governing power in Syria. Thank goodness we didn't take that on. And it also said that the United States should be involved in the creation of an Armenian state and a Kurdish state. And if some of you follow the news and watch this a little bit, and you're interested in the Middle East, you'll know that this question of a Kurdish state remains very much in the news. Just 2 weeks ago, the Kurds in Iraq voted to create their own state. So this is still very much in the news and very powerful. In the 1920s, this American interest in the Middle East led to thousands of American missionaries, businessmen, and diplomats going to the region for the first time. They're a group that one historian, Robert Kaplan, has called the Arabists. They're a group of Americans, many of them born in Lebanon, born in Syria, born in Egypt, who will become the people who will create American policy towards the Middle East in the 1930s and in the 1940s. Now, there's probably no good way to end a lecture like this on a happy note. Next slide, please. Except to note how nasty these decisions became among the people who were responsible for trying to govern American policy. I think it's not the First World War that disillusioned so many Americans. It is the mess of the peace that disillusioned so many Americans. And the first quotation I have up here is from William Bullitt. He later became the first American ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1933. Bullitt was an American advisor to the Commission here at the Paris Peace Conference. When he found out about some of these decisions that were being made, he was so furious that he resigned. And then he wrote to his mother, "I'm going to go lie on the sand and watch the world go to hell," which is exactly what he did. He went down to the south of France, and he started writing his memoir of the Peace Conference and the south of France, which is not a bad place to do it. Bliss wrote, "What a wretched mess it all is. If the rest of the world will let us alone, I think we had better stay on our side of the water and keep alive the spark of civilization to relight the torch after it is extinguished over here. If I ever had any illusions, they are all dispelled." And this, I think, is where America's disillusion with the First World War, where some of America's forgetfulness of the First World War comes from. It's not the war itself. It's not the service of those Connecticut soldiers that Christine showed earlier. It's not the service of American volunteers who helped to pay for ambulances and helped to, in some cases, go to France and drive those ambulances. It is the frustration that their sacrifice ended up producing this terrible peace treaty that left the world in a more dangerous place, not a more secure place. And I have a photograph up here of American troops who get deployed to northern Russia in 1919 and into eastern Russia, in a place called Vladivostok on the Pacific Ocean, as the United States at first thought that it would send troops into Russia to try to destroy the Bolshevik Revolution that had begun there, an event that most Americans have long forgotten, an event that every Russian understands and remembers as if it happened yesterday. I'm also reminded one of the speakers that has been on this very stage, Colin Powell, the former American Secretary of State and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Colin Powell said there was a pottery barn rule for international relations. If you break it, you are responsible for helping to put it back together. Now, the United States wasn't really responsible for the breaking of the Middle East and the breaking of many other parts of the world. The United States finds itself involved in a territorial dispute between China and Japan, for instance, that's going to produce really negative, really poisonous problems for the United States in the 1920s and 1930s. But at the same time, most Americans, I would guess from here in New Haven all the way up to the halls of power to Tasker Bliss, believe that even if the United States hadn't had a role in breaking the pot, the United States had nevertheless declared war. The United States had nevertheless sent an army overseas. The United States nevertheless had a president who issued a statement like the 14 Points, claiming that the United States would fight for the rights of people everywhere. Therefore, the United States, whether it broke it or not, had in fact bought it. They also saw France and Britain as totally out of ideas. Countries that would do something like the Sykes-Picot Agreement, they believed, did not have the right to redesign and recreate the world in their own image. And as I said, just down the road in Yale are these beautiful maps of Americans trying to do that, trying to figure out how you could divide Europe into smaller and smaller pieces, how to figure out where the borders of Poland should be, who is a Romanian, how to figure out where the borders of various countries in the Balkans ought to be. And here are these American professors sitting down, trying to figure out how to do this, working first out of the offices of the New York Public Library, and then later working in Paris when President Wilson moved there. And in the archives are these descriptions of the President of the United States and some of these professors sitting on the floor of the President's hotel room with giant maps and colored pencils, trying to figure out where these borders ought to go. It's an amazing thing for a country that had remained neutral in this war for 3 years. The United States also saw the rising power of Russia and Japan as potential threats. In fact, the United States Navy at the end of the First World War thought that Japan was the greatest threat to American security. And of course, they were right. as the United States moved into the 20s and into the 30s. The Soviet Union, this terrifying new model of what the world was going to look like, this revolutionary, anti-imperial, anti-American entity that had been created as a direct result of the First World War, also terrified a lot of Americans. So there was a sense that America was involved in the war now and could not simply pull aside and pull away from it even if they wanted to. Now there were some Americans in the 20s and in the 30s that tried, so-called isolationists, that tried the best they could to ignore what was happening on the other side of the ocean. But it was clear that the United States could no longer do it. Now, what would have happened if the United States had not been involved in the First World War? My guess is these threats would have prevented themselves to Americans anyway. Japan would nevertheless have risen to the very strong and very powerful position that it came into at the end of the First World War. There still would have been a Russian Revolution, no matter what the United States had done. But my guess is, and it's hard to know, the United States would have felt less of an obligation to involve itself in every corner of the world, to involve itself as the sponsor, the protector of these universal rights and universal freedoms that Americans first expressed, of course, in the Declaration of Independence in July of 1776. There's no way to know, but my sense is, without a declaration of war, without those men from New Haven going over there to defeat the German army, there wouldn't have been a group of professors sitting in Washington, D.C. and New York City trying literally to redraw the boundaries of the world. It's also hard to know, but my guess is that if not for the First World War, the United States would not have been so fully a part of the international community, despite its rejection of the League of Nations. And the United States wouldn't have been so deeply involved in international security threats from Syria to China to Russia and more, a role, of course, that this country continues to play even a century after the events. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. And, you know, in some ways, it almost seems like instead of the war to end all wars, it was the war that spawned a whole bunch of other wars and conflicts. So it's very interesting. As you can see, World War I played a key role in what would come over the next 100 years and is still with us today. So it's very relevant. So at this time, I'd like to turn over the program to Cindy Simoneau, who's the chair of the journalism department. And Cindy actually was the person who had the initial idea for having a program on World War I. And Cindy, would you like to come up?
Thanks, Joe. When we were putting the program together, we were trying to figure out how we had a sense of balance. Joe and I are former journalists, or I'm a journalism educator. We were looking for how can we gain some perspective on all different aspects of the war. So we decided to bring in the German perspective, and we were blessed enough to have the willingness of our colleague, Dr. Troy Paddock, who's a professor of modern European history and the chair of the history department at Southern here. Dr. Paddock has research interests that focus on modern German cultural and intellectual history, and he has a special interest in propaganda. He has a book called Creating the Russian Peril, Education, the Public Sphere, and National Identity in Imperial Germany. He's edited 2 volumes on World War I and propaganda, and A Call to Arms, Propaganda and Public Opinion, and Newspapers in the Great War. He has articles published in German history, Central European history, Rethinking History, Philosophy, and Geography. And since 2013, he's been co-editor of Environmental Space and Place, and he's president this year of the New England Historical Association. So to give us a sense of balance from the German perspective, my colleague, Dr. Troy Paddock.
Thank you all for being here. I will be brief. I want to thank Michael for his interesting talk because he gives me a couple of starting points. The British Council, which is sort of, think of it as a PR firm for the British government, in 2014 published a pamphlet called Remembering the World in the War, thinking that it would be really important for people to understand the importance of the Great War and understanding the modern world. As a German historian, I found the pamphlet frustrating but enlightening. It talks about a trip that British officials had taken to the Middle East, and they wanted to talk about World War I, and the only thing the people wanted to talk to the British representatives about were Sykes-Picot. And they said, why could you possibly be interested in something that was over 100 years old? And sort of the blinders that the British had on their actions in the Middle East during the First World War, I think is representative of the blinders that the West has largely had towards the Middle East during the First World War and since then. The Germans are no exception. They also had their own interest in the Middle East as well, as they were allies of the Ottoman Empire. So I want to talk to you very briefly about three things. One is sort of this lack of awareness of the East. When we think about the First World War in the United States, we invariably think of the Western Front. We think of trench warfare. Sometimes we think of the Christmas truce as sort of a nice shining light in an otherwise dismal affair. All of that's valid, all of that's important. But World War I starts because of what's going on in the East. It starts because what could have been a third Balkan War ends up becoming a world war because the great powers here, most importantly Russia, I would argue, to a lesser extent Germany, decide that they're not going to stand by as Austria-Hungary wishes to punish Serbia for its role in supporting the assassination of the Crown Prince, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. A historian of Russia, Dominic Levin, talks about World War I essentially being a war about the Ukraine, and I think he's right. Levin talks about it in terms of nationality and nationalism and the nationalist movements within the Russian Empire. I think of it more in terms of geopolitical interest, insofar as one of Russia's driving interests has always been to try to get access from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean Sea, unfettered. I probably should have given Cindy a map to show where Istanbul is, or Constantinople. Michael mentioned that one of the questions would be what to do with Constantinople. Constantinople and the Bosporus and Dardanelles essentially serve as a choking point between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. You cannot sail through there without the permission of the Turkish government. If you're the Russian Navy, that's permission that's rather difficult to get. And so one of the interests that Russia has had since they've had a navy in the Black Sea was trying to get unfettered access through there. A third Balkan War was the potential for them to get that access if they win, if they're on the right side and they play their cards right. And that is something that you will almost never hear whenever we're talking about the First World War in the United States. But the East really does play an important role. As a German historian, I'm obligated to talk about the Treaty of Versailles. The Germans hate the Treaty of Versailles, but there are two different things that need to be discussed. There's one reason why I think they should hate it. The war guilt clause is silly. Do the Germans make a number of mistakes? Absolutely. But there were enough mistakes to go around to say that one country was solely responsible is just irresponsible. And from a psychological point of view, it creates a great deal of resentment that right-wing groups, and yes, people like Adolf Hitler and the little tiny National Socialist German Workers' Party was able to take advantage of. But the Treaty of Versailles does not cause the rise of Hitler. The other aspect about the Treaty of Versailles that the Germans like to complain about are the reparations, saying that they were terribly unfair. Were they high? Yes. Could the German government, if they had made a good faith effort to meet those payments, paid them? Yes. They could have done it. But the German government decided they didn't want to do it, and so they pursued inflationary policies that undermine their own economy, actually break their own citizens, but they get what they want. They get the United States to get involved in making reparations, and you have the Dawes Plan. And you have this lovely triangle trade going on here. You have the United States sending money to Germany to help make reparation payments to Britain and France, and they use money that they get from Germany to help pay back loans that they got from the United States to help pay for the war. Only in America can you get that. The other aspect about the Treaty of Versailles that makes it look bad, but again, you have to point now to the Allies, is after the war, the willingness of the Allies, and here the finger once again has to be pointed to Britain, to undermine the treaty themselves. And here Michael also mentioned one of the causes, the Russian Revolution. As the specter of communism hung in Eastern Europe, you found the Western powers more and more fearful of communism spreading into Europe and into their own nations. One of the things that they found appealing about fascism was that it was stridently anti-communist. One of the first things that Hitler did successfully was destroy the Communist Party in Germany. And so one of the things to keep in mind about sort of the appeasement of Hitler was the only reason he could violate the terms of the Treaty of Versailles was because the British let him. I mean, in 1935, the British negotiate with Hitler to allow the Germans to start rebuilding their navy. And they do this without telling the French or the US that they're actually going to do this. And so this sort of gives Hitler an awareness that, that he would be able to renegotiate or ignore, if you prefer to use that term, the terms of the Treaty of Versailles and help rebuild Germany and help rebuild a German war machine. And we all know how that ends. The last point that I want to make is to answer the question of what would have happened had the US not gotten involved in World War I. I still think the Germans lose. It would have taken longer, but World War I by this point had essentially become a war of attrition. And the Germans did not have enough access to the material resources they needed to prosecute a war. And to be candid, they were running out of people too, who could fight the war. And so they eventually would have had to surrender. The fact that they did surrender when they did was beneficial for everyone since the fighting stopped, but they didn't experience the complete collapse. And this is one of the mistakes that the Allies made in the First World War that they didn't make in the Second World War. Except for the first few weeks and then the last month and a half or so, all of the fighting in World War I does not take place in Germany. It takes place on the soil of other nations. So when the Germans sort of stopped fighting, they honestly, the civilians had no idea that they were losing the war. They knew life was extraordinarily hard. They knew that. But they thought they were winning. And so when the war stops and they discovered they'd lost, it was shocking. And there was a lot of resentment that was exacerbated by the Treaty of Versailles. With World War II, the German population suffered greatly, but the Allies made sure they knew they lost. There was an occupation, and there was no doubts. And so that in some ways, you can argue the US did learn something from the First World War, is how to conclude a peace a little better than the First World War was done. And that's all I want to say for today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Troy. Our students here at Southern Connecticut State University started studying World War I from the perspective of the descendants of the soldiers and the volunteers that went to war. And when we started to look into creating our capstone course, and that's a course where it brings together all of what you've learned in different years in our liberal education program and applies them to a big project producing course, we've discovered the State of Connecticut's library project for remembering World War I. And we were intrigued by the idea of telling other people's stories. And that's what we do in journalism, tell the stories from other people's perspectives. And we decided, what would it be like if we got involved and met these people who had their loved ones' belongings or had questions about their loved ones. And we participated with the library in researching some of the history. And that's what our students have been doing. As students yourselves, many of you, you know what it's like to have a book that you try to find relevant to the materials that your teachers are supplementing or teaching you in the classroom. And we, too, were struggling with how do we make this local for our students? How do we make them see how important a role Connecticut played in World War I? So there were a couple of books that we turned to, and Jody, my professor, Jody Gill, who's here on the stage working our tech crew today, she and I picked up this book, New Haven in World War I, at the recommendation of Christine Pitsley at State Library, and we opened it on a plane ride to a conference, and we looked at each other and said, this is exactly what we need. So we were very thrilled on our plane ride back and forth to read the book called New Haven in World War I by Laura Macaluso, our next speaker. Laura researches and writes about visual and material culture, specifically on monuments, murals, museum collections. And she's the author of 4 books on New Haven. Her book, New Haven in World War I, was endorsed by World War I Centennial Commission. In April, she presented the paper, The Spirit of 1776 and 1917, Town and Gown Go to War, at the International Conference in New Zealand. She has 3 books coming out next year, including the publication of her dissertation, The Public Art Space of New Haven, Themes in the Creation of a City Identity in Thomas Jefferson's Virginia. She's the editor of a collection of essays titled Monument Culture, International Perspectives on the Future of Monuments in a Changing World, a very timely topic in the news these days. And she writes grants for 2 arts organizations in Central Virginia, where she lives with her husband, Jeffrey Nichols, who's the president and CEO of Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest. Jeffrey is also a Southern alum. I'd like to introduce you to you today, Dr. Laura Macaluso, one of our Southern alums.
Thank you. It's great to be back at Southern, and it's always great to be in New Haven, a city that I still love dearly. It was really important to me growing up in the Naugatuck Valley, as I did. And maybe some of you have friends or know folks from the Tuck as well. So I'm an adopted Virginian these days, but I'm still working on New Haven because there's so much material and so much of interest, I think, still to do for the Elm City. But today I will share with you some monumental stories of New Haven in World War I. Some of the material is from my book, but a lot is not, because I wrote the book at the end of 2015, came out in April 2000. Well, now I'm messing myself up because it came out this year, didn't it, Christine? So it was last year I wrote the book came out this year, but since that time, I've continued to do some reading as I've been able to for different presentations and articles, and have discovered new things. So Jody, if I could have the first, thank you. So to bring us back from this amazing international story that Troy and Dr. Nieberg shared with us just now, to bring us back here to New Haven, to the Elm City. It's kind of false to always talk about the 102nd Regiment, but it's so important. It's an overriding monumental story of New Haven. But just remember that New Haveners and Connecticuters were not all members of the 102nd Regiment, that they went to the Western Front and to other places in World War I, as George told us, as ambulance drivers, as members of the Navy, as Marines, and as Army infantry for other divisions, other regiments. But still, the 102nd is our regiment, and so it's an important story to keep with you. And of course, it was here on this side of town, the west side of town of New Haven, where the 102nd Regiment came together during the summer of 1917. And it was a new division, the 26th Yankee Division, and it was a regiment created out of Connecticut National Guard units already in existence, the first of Hartford and the second of New Haven, which came together, the 1 and 2 became the 102nd, and New Haven became its home. Yale University had a huge tract of land on the west side of town, which they still own, which has now become the so-called West Campus of Yale University, and where the Yale Bowl is, for example. And the tent city for the 102nd was erected here on the grounds of Yale Field, which became known then as Camp Yale. And folks from across the state, from across Connecticut, and then eventually beyond, came together to train as doughboys, as infantrymen, to get themselves ready to deploy to Western Europe. And these are just some photos of the 102nd. During the summer of 1917, they were digging trenches, they were doing maneuvers, they were exercising, and they were also, I think, probably doing a lot of sitting around, playing with their guns as they are in the upper right-hand corner, trying to figure out, what is this about? What is about to happen to them? And I'm guessing smoking a lot, and telling a lot of jokes, and also kind of bonding with these fellows that they are meeting for the first time. Next slide, please. But also on the other side, the west side of town, the side that Camp Yale is developing, is something that I really had never heard of until I was working on the book and then afterward, which is that Yale itself has an armory building, which is now not in existence. But the Yale Armory is where the Yale Battery is coming together in training for the war, and they also have cavalry out there. So the west side of town, again, becomes the place where all this action begins to happen during the summer. And the Yale Battery is comprised of guns, 4 guns at the beginning, that the French government, and these guns are called French 75s. I don't know anything about guns and war material and the material for going to war. Terribly important stuff, I know, but not something I'm terribly attracted to. But the guns are going to become a theme that we'll see as we move on to our next slides. So while all this activity is happening at Yale Field and at the Battery, at the Armory, it's not just there, sequestered away in this rural, part of town. It's hard to remember, but New Haven is really centered around the 9 squares, right? The development of New Haven begins downtown in the center square and grows out over time. 100 years ago, the outskirts of all of the edges of New Haven are rural farming, kind of very trees and green grass, and people with their houses, with large gardens and farms. So what's happening, the military preparations that are happening on the west side of town, yes, that's one thing, but not a lot of folks are seeing that because they're not driving in on Derby Avenue in fast-moving automobiles like we do today, right? It's just a tucked-away part of the city. The green is the heart of the city, and city people, City Hall realizes this, and Yale realizes this, and so, in fact, they bring all the activity that's going on at Camp Yale and at the Armory to downtown New Haven, to the center of the city, to our city identity, the green, and activity is going on there every day. Something or another is reminding people that war preparations are happening, which then I think really is sending a message to everyone, you better be involved too. Okay, because these young men, sailors seen in the lower left corner, exercising on the green, the doughboys in the upper left-hand corner, going through their motions with fake dummy guns because they actually didn't have the rifles yet that they were going to use, so they used these wooden things instead to give the sense of weight. Training with those dummy guns on the green, that's the original flagpole up in the upper corner there of that photograph. So you see that flagpole is going to be removed and replaced by the World War I monument after all this is over. And love this picture in the lower right-hand corner of the infantry holding their flags, marching, parading around the green. This is propaganda, not in poster form, right, in real life form. And this is happening, as I said, for everyone that's walking, going to school, going to work, going around downtown New Haven. They're seeing this, and it's a very clear message about, it's a pro-war stance. Right, next slide, please. I think this stuff is amazing. This didn't make it into the book. It's one of my biggest disappointments because I discovered the photographic collection at Yale after the book was published. But it blew my mind to think that these big guns were dragged across town, as you see in the upper right-hand corner, from Camp Yale, from the west side of town, dragged across to the green so that they can shoot these guns off right next to Center Church, the earliest church of New Haven, where New Haven, the city, began, is at that church, a sacred site that most of you probably know is also a cemetery, right? Underneath the green are the bodies of all the first New Haveners, and they're just blowing these guns off. Again, sending this huge message that we Americans are ready to go to war, that we've got the stuff, and all the public in the back, you see the American flags hanging from the facades of the 3 churches on the green. Terribly iconic moment. This photograph to me should really not be buried in Yale, but it is, so what can we do? So who are these young men training with these guns, digging trenches, preparing to go to a place they've never heard of? They are the neighbors and friends of your 18, 19, 20-year-old New Haven youth, like John Dillon and Timothy Ahern, 2 young men from Fairhaven, the opposite side of town, over the river, right? A lot of these folks are in the Connecticut National Guard, so they're drafted, but so they are kind of subsumed into the creation of the 102nd Regiment. Others are drafted. Timothy Ahern is the fellow on the top left corner, 4th in. Timothy Ahern is the man who is memorialized in the bronze statue in El Grasso Boulevard and Derby Avenue, right, at West River Memorial Park in New Haven, which a lot of you probably drive by. He is friends with John Dillon, who is seen also in the top row, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in from the right. They're members together in Fairhaven of a club called the Maple Athletic Club. And clubs are just a huge part of life. 100 years ago in the Elm City. There are so many clubs in every neighborhood, probably at least 5, 6, 7 clubs, sporting clubs, so that these folks would get together and box. They would have canoe races. They would have baseball. It was very much just based around the idea of sports and athleticism, which again is kind of an important thing to think about because you see them here. Here they go from being Maple Athletic Club members, these young men in their bow ties. Then they become doughboys going overseas to fight in France. And you look at them. They're healthy, they're strapping, they're not really thin. I mean, they're kind of meaty, right? They're ready to fight, and that actually is commented on by the German army, by the French army, that Americans who arrive, they're very green, which means that they don't really know what they're doing yet in terms of going to war. But physically, they're very capable, and that will be a positive for the American army and for the Allies in general. And so, where are they going? Well, one place that this 102nd Regiment goes, and Timothy Ahern and John Dillon go with them, not to mention Sergeant Stubby, who's with them by this point as well, too. They're going to fight at the Western Front, and the one of the earliest places that Americans fight, and they fight on their own, is in a place called Sykes-Picot, which is a village in France, in the northeast of France, 5 hours from Paris. And Sykes-Picot, this little village of 102 citizens, it's really a hamlet, is an unexpected battle. The Americans aren't really prepared for it. It comes in the wee hours of the morning of April 20th, 1918. And it lasts all day. And this is what happens to the little village after a day's artillery bombardment. that then devolved into hand-to-hand combat with bayonets, and even, more crazy stories, I think, come out of the Battle of Seicheprey about meat cleavers being picked up and used, about rocks being used, deadly battle in which a lot of the 102nd is wasted, right? 650 members are wounded or are killed, 100 taken prisoner, and that's against the 100 members of the German infantry. So it's a lopsided, not really in favor of the Americans. And what happens to the idea of Seicheprey afterward is something that I think Christine can help us talk about as to why Americans in general don't remember this early battle, but New Haven always remembers this battle. And it's just today, in 2017, that we have completely forgotten it again. But New Haven during the 20th century, it was really important. And it's something, if you go to Seicheprey, it's kind of shocking, right, to see the village in the far back. You can see the church spire in the upper left-hand corner, and this beautiful sunflower field right outside the village today. You think, gosh, really? How could these things have happened here? But they did. And if you drive around France, come back. Well, if you drive around France, thank you, you will see the reminders of war everywhere. And maybe this is part of the reason why Americans are having a lot of trouble remembering World War I, because we don't have those physical reminders. This German trench system is only about an hour outside of Seicheprey. Totally unexpected to be just driving and to see this miles and miles long, deeply cut scar into the earth with this beautifully crafted trenches, but these are German trenches, but I'm sure there's similarities. Some of it's been rebuilt with wood and thatching, but the stonework is original, the metal that was inserted there is original. And this is a pig's tail that's inserted into the ground, which helps to lock down all of the horrible wires that everyone is caught in, that you've heard so much about, I'm sure. And it's spray painted pink because you can literally step directly on it and you can't pull it. I did try to pull it out of the earth. You can't pull it out. I mean, it's just so tightly stuck in with concrete, I'm sure. Next slide, please. So Seicheprey, with its rebuilt Romanesque church, is so important to Connecticut, to New Haven, that this is the town where our state builds its World War I memorial. And our memorial is this fountain, right? The American fountain. It's got a sign that says Fountain American, put in on the 5th anniversary, 1923. I think it's actually really interesting to think about it. Christine and I have tried to figure out what is the story exactly behind how this fountain, this memorial came into being, especially when you look at the size and the scope of the memorials put up by states like Pennsylvania and Missouri. Huge structures of granite and marble and of eternal flames and bronze victory figures. And Connecticut puts up this little fountain in this little village. I think it probably says a lot about Connecticut, right? About being nutmeggers, about being very fiscally responsible, about doing something very practical, right? Because a fountain is supposed to supply water to the village versus something that is really just there for show. Also, to be seen outside Seicheprey and this kind of general area of France are these wonderful little museums that people have put up just because they are so passionate about the story of World War I. This little museum, in fact, was put up by a Dutchman who came to France just to open a museum because he's collected so much World War I materials, particularly about the Americans. I mean, the Europeans are really interested in the American perspective, but we just don't have a lot of opportunities to go back and forth about that. Go ahead. Also to be seen are just so many monuments. In every village, like this French infantryman with his blue uniform, and this greater monument, this bronze monument also to the Americans, the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force. But what I thought was really important to see is that the French monument has American flags stuck into the little flower pot sitting at the bottom, right? The French always remember American participation and the special relationship. And that's a story about World War I, again, that maybe we Americans, just tend to forget and don't tend to celebrate enough. And then these places, this is what you also see outside of Sykes-Picot, the hard places to see, right? The American military cemeteries with its very distinctive marble Latin crosses, and the German military cemeteries, which are painted very stark black in deep contrast. Belgian cemeteries, English cemeteries, French cemeteries, they're everywhere outside of Sykes-Picot. And if you didn't end up in one of those cemeteries, thankfully, and if you did come home to New Haven, come home to Connecticut, like Stubby did with Bob Conroy, his owner, in Paris, you maybe got your photograph taken. You're a souvenir of the time that you served in France. So they did. And then, like the 102nd Regiment Band seen in the upper level there, you're mustering, you come and muster out then at Camp Devens, which is in Massachusetts, right? So that's basically March, April. In May, lower right-hand corner, you're back in New Haven, and you're having your welcome home parade. And if you are really super interested in remembering your service, as so many of this generation was, you form your veterans chapters. And it is thanks to these folks. This is John Dillon again, who we saw on the earlier slide, the young man from Fairhaven. He becomes the president of the local chapter, the New Haven chapter of the 102nd Regiment, Yankee Division. You march in parades, you wear your special uniforms, you have dinners together in Boston. You actually have a drinking club, that's a medal, it's called the Last Man Standing. They had drinking clubs. Next slide, please. And then you start building monuments here, right? So that's the dedication ceremony to the World War I memorial flagpole on the green. And I heard today that New Haven's going to actually have a rededication ceremony next year. And then there's Timothy Ahern. So John Dillon, things worked out for some folks who returned. John Dillon came home to Fairhaven. He married. He'd had 3 children. He went into his family's business. He had a good, solid life. Timothy Ahern came back from war, and he didn't have a job to go back to because the Marlin Firearms Company didn't need the workers anymore. And he becomes some kind of worker, we're not sure. He travels across the country, and he dies at age 25 in California. And so the New Haven chapter decides that Timothy Ahern is the person that they're going to remember when the WPA rolls around in the 1930s, providing funds, monies, to put together public art projects like this memorial. And uniquely is this, I think, this beautiful monument in New Haven, which is the Oberlin Memorial Windows in Hampton Town Hall. You can sneak in. The doors are shut. You have to kind of go around the building, but do if you can. It's just a really unique type of monument created from World War I, but I love it because, of course, it shows the Battle of Sykes-Picot. You'll see that left-hand panel, glass panel, and you see the meat cleavers, and you see the artillery blasts, and you see the village being blown to pieces. So it's a great kind of use of a very traditional, very old type of art making, monument making, and transferring it into contemporary times, which is here in 1938, 1939 when it's installed. So to end, if you're special, you might also get your portrait painted. So Stubby's special that way. So the year before he dies, Bob Conroy gets his portrait painted by a famous Washington, D.C. based artist. But I think what's important to note about Stubby is that he's just one of, hundreds, if not thousands of mascots who went abroad during World War I. But what makes him special are the things that he did and the things that happened to him, but also the fact that Bob Conroy, his owner, made him kind of something special, right? It's Bob hung his own medals on Stubby's coat, the coat that was made by French villagers for him. So it's really a kind of a story. Next slide, please. It's really a story about, good PR. Because look, Bob is putting Stubby on stage here in New Haven as early as May 1919 at the Bijou Theater, right? He's putting him on stage, he's putting him in parades, he's hanging the medals on him. That's kind of part of the reason why Stubby's story has been picked up and is going to be made into this animated movie, which I understand we get to watch a video of right now. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura. For those of you who wonder where Sergeant Stubby resides to this day, he's in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. They have no intention of sending him back to Connecticut, so you have to go see him there. He was taxidermed, so his skin is on the outside of a concrete cast of him, and his cremains were inserted inside of that cask. So that's where Stubby is today. Through the hard work of the State Library System and Christine Pitsley particularly, Connecticut is going to host one of the 3 world premieres of the Stubby animated movie. One is going to be in Hollywood, one is going to be in DC at the Smithsonian, and one is going to be in Connecticut. So we gave you all brochures today to remind you that in April in Connecticut we will be hosting a Stubby premiere. We were lucky enough to have the production company send us a longer trailer. So we're going to show you the trailer now. While you're watching it, I want you to think of your questions because we have a microphone right down front here. And we're going to take your questions before we dismiss for the day as soon as we finish with the Stubby trailer. And here's Stubby.
He was homeless and hungry. Life on the streets was tough.
Get out of here, you stinking mutt! Go!
Then one day, he met a soldier, and together they would embark on an adventure that would help change the world.
Yeah, when I discovered the story, I was like captivated because here was a stray dog living on the streets of New Haven, Connecticut, homeless, hungry, and a bunch of soldiers came to town and they just adopted him, and so the story began.
I guess it really is probably the first or one of the only films I can think of, animated family films that takes place during war, and particularly World War I.
The fact that it's going to be animated will probably bring it to an audience, i.e. young children, that wouldn't normally know about the story. Having said that, what's great as an adult and a mother of younger children, it appeals to both generations.
The thing that I thought was really cool about this project is that it's the first time in my career, and I think Mark's career as well, where we get to animate and work on a project based on real events. And that to me is one of the coolest things about this project.
We are one of, if not the first major animated film to be based on a true story. It's the story of a man and a dog in the middle of a conflict who keep each other safe and keep each other alive.
You did a great work to speak about that time. This is very important time.
I have a big link with the First World War. My great-grandfather was the Prime Minister when the First World War started, and he lost his son, Raymond, after whom, in fact, my father was named, and after whom my son is named.
You know, it's a tough subject matter to get, especially in a family film, but this isn't a movie about the horrors of war as much as it's about the bond between a dog and a soldier.
As a military child, also, I definitely highly recommend it for those who are from civilian families so that they can get a glimpse of what it was like and have perhaps a better appreciation for what people do for the military.
It's really important to me that not only are we entertaining, but we're educating as well. So it's a long forgotten war. People know very little about it. And we're able to give them a snapshot into this period of time 100 years ago.
It is a long time ago, but also it seems like yesterday at the same time. It will open up people's eyes to the history of that time.
Through the art of animation, we're able to bring that period of history alive and bring these stories back into the popular consciousness for audiences of all ages. We're able to tell a dog's eye view of American history.
We all love our dogs, and this combination of the story of a dog and the relationship with a man and military history, I felt it was really quite remarkable.
This film is a showcase for an extraordinary being who happened to have 4 legs.
So April 13th is the movie theater opening, and so it'll be in early April that Connecticut hopes to have host one of the premieres. I invite you all to keep following that news because that's the story of Connecticut in New Haven. Every time you see Stubby and his owner smuggles him off to Europe, and Stubby is the most decorated war dog there was. He leads a lot of parades when he comes back to the United States. He meets various presidents of the United States. His owner goes on to study at Georgetown, so he's a popular, brings Stubby along. He's a popular hero in DC. So you'll see a lot of connections there from Connecticut. And if you go to the Smithsonian exhibit, you also should learn about the pigeon who carried messages along for World War I. So the role of animals in the war besides just oxen and horses that predated the motorized ambulance corps in Europe. So now it's your time to ask some questions. As you're starting to think and come up to the center microphone, anyone who has a question for our panel, I want to remind you that each of our speakers and our guests today have volunteered to speak on the volunteerism, the medical aspects, Connecticut, the state of Connecticut, the world history, and the German perspective. As you're leaving, our university photographer invites each school on the way out, if we take an orderly tack to this, I'm not sure, Isabel, how you're going to do that, to go to the ambulance with our 2 guests who were lucky enough to have brought the ambulance for you, and they'd be glad to take a school picture with the ambulance representatives here as well for you to take back with you or us to get to you through Joe's office. So if each school, at the end, when we're all finished, we can orderly just take a few minutes to organize, we'd be glad to do that for you as well. So who has a question for us? Come on up to the microphone. It's right here in the center. The lights are in my eyes, so you come right up front and I'll be able to see you. Go ahead.
Is there any trace of Stubby's family still alive? Like, not still alive, but like, did you guys ever find out who his family was?
Yeah, there are. Christine?
Yes, we've actually been working with his grandson, who lives half of the year in Lyme and the other half in New York. I actually just talked to him a couple days ago, and there's a whole lot of stuff that they're doing. They've taken really good care of Stubby's legacy, and Robert Conroy, who is called his companion. They don't like to call him owner because they had a really good relationship. But yes, there are still his grandchildren, and he recently met another cousin, Margaret Conroy, who Helena Bonham Carter plays. Her son, or her grandson, is just now on the scene. And one note about that preview, you guys are the first people in the country to see that clip. The studio is releasing that clip on Veterans Day, so this Saturday. So you guys are the first in the country to see it.
There you go.
Thank you.
Other questions about the war, about the panel? We have someone coming down. You can get in line here, go faster if you know you have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. There was a sort of a topic of the war that I think those of us who studied the war a lot sort of know very well, but perhaps has been certainly not high school students are as aware of it. And you've referred to it, the horror of the trench warfare, the unprecedented nature of the slaughter, the mistakes, military mistakes that led to such slaughter. And I was wondering, just the psychological effect of that seems to have perhaps driven many of the poor decisions that were made, certainly in a democratic society where politicians are trying to respond to what, people's desires are. Many of the poor decisions after the war seem to have been driven to a certain degree by that degree of slaughter, that unprecedented nature of that war that no one expected. I was wondering if any of you could comment on that as far as an effect on the Versailles Treaty and what came after.
My first response would be that, we sometimes say that generals fight the same war over again, but in the 20s and 30s, they're trying to come up with any way to do anything other than fight a trench war again. So the modern ideas of air warfare, modern ideas of tanks, and modern ideas of mechanization all come out of a powerful desire not to do what they did in World War I. The only other thing that I might say is that it's virtually impossible for a general in the First World War to keep his job if his strategy is, let's not do anything. You've got a country at war, a country mobilized. In the case of France, your country is invaded and occupied. So, it's not my view that the generals of World War I were somehow congenitally more stupid than the generals that came before and after. What's different is the scale and monumental nature of the task. And if the politicians aren't going to find a way out of it, then it's incumbent upon the generals to do it. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but...
Anyone else, the impact of trench warfare on people? Okay, Nick?
Yes, hi. Really enjoyed your presentation. I was wondering if any of you know the name Sergeant Bernard Early. Does that ring a bell?
Early, E-A-R-L-Y?
E-A-R-L-Y.
Why should we know him?
Let me ask you another question. Are you familiar with Sergeant Alvin York?
Yes.
Everyone is. And no one knows who Sergeant Bernard Early was. Sergeant Bernard Early was the sergeant commanding the platoon of which York was a part on October 8th, 1918. Happens to be my great uncle, but he was one of the most well-known heroes, really, of World War I from New Haven. Dr. Macaluso mentioned, the 102nd was the New Haven Regiment, but Early was a sergeant in the 82nd All-American Division, and there was a huge amount of controversy about what the members of that patrol did. There were 17 men who ended up, you've all heard the stories about the single-handed capture by York of 132 Germans and so forth and so on. But Early happens to be buried across the street from the southern campus, was a New Havener, was born in Ireland, was really a hero to Irish Americans in New Haven. And the controversy, you've probably seen the movie, the eponymous movie, Sergeant York, over time. He's portrayed in the movie. The controversy continued to erupt. Eventually, if you remember the movie, he was machine gunned when they came upon the Germans at first, but eventually Early was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross in 1929, so 11 years after the end of the war. And it's a fascinating story with a New Haven connection. All the papers were writing about it at the time. What apparently happened was the War College wanted to stage a reenactment of the York event, and so they went out to find the patrol members who were involved in it, invited them to Washington to participate in this. And all hell broke loose because they had not received credit for what had been done. It really was not a one-man event. And there's been a lot of battlefield archaeology done recently in France about that. I actually was invited to go and went in 2009 to dig on that site to see if forensically they could determine what had really happened. The French Minister of War was there. But it's a huge New Haven connection that particularly Dr. Macaluso might be interested in.
It is. I'm just a little bit surprised that I don't remember, reading I mean, I read through newspapers and
Yeah.
don't, really recall.
I have them. I'll give them to you. I brought them
love
here.
that.
There was an enormous dinner and parade in 1929 at the old Hotel Guard, where he was honored after that War College event. The Secretary of War gave him a big hug and said that, he said something, he had a great line, which I don't remember at this point, Secretary Hurley, another Irishman. But I don't know if there are any older New Haveners in the audience. They might remember that name. He was really a hero.
I think Christine at the State Library would be interested in talking to you as well.
Yes.
Connecticut is a national repository for information.
The New York Times has been writing about it. Actually, I don't want to monopolize time, but I was so interested in this, hearing these stories as a kid growing up in New Haven. The story to New Haveners was Early and the other 16 members of that patrol really did a lot of what York was credited with, but for public relations reasons, because the U.S. was isolationist, they needed to find a hero, the Army did, to convince Americans that, this was the right thing to do. Similar to the Jessica Lynch story that happened. I mean, nothing is really new in the world. The Pat Tilley story in Afghanistan and Iraq, find the hero.
Have you spoken with Ed Langle about
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's actually a relative of
I
York.
know, that's why I brought him up.
Yeah.
So,
But the last thing I was going to mention was that I had heard these stories for years, and so eventually I decided to find out how much of it was really true or not. So I decided to try to locate the relatives of all 16 men in that patrol, so my contemporaries, and I was able to find 13 of the 16 and heard from their relatives the same story, that they had been.
Okay, we're going to be
love to
following up
talk
with
to
you,
you.
sir.
Thank you.
It's
Yeah.
Brock, are you
I'll
still
talk
here?
to you after.
Great. Fabulous.
Brock, you need to find this man over here and find out where that grave is across the street so we can go photograph it for Christine Pitsley. Okay, next, sir.
Yes, causality in the First World War. Who is really to blame? Russia, Germany, Austria, or Serbia?
We're going to settle it right now.
Yes.
100 years later. Gentlemen, ladies, anybody?
You want to go first?
Who is to blame?
I mean, I think what happens is that the states of Europe get a crisis that isn't the one that they're prepared for. They're expecting, the states of Europe have war planned for one kind of crisis, and the crisis they get doesn't fit the mold. And Austria, for reasons particular to Austria that I don't want to get into here, but I can offline if you want, decide to accelerate the timeline and put a 48-hour limit on their ultimatum. That's the event that causes the states of Europe to try to respond, and they're not set up to deal with the crisis that they get. So when I teach the First World War to War College students, my message to them is that it's really easy to take a system that is relatively stable, to have the system presented with an international crisis it's not ready for, and the system it can't handle it. And that's what I think happened in 1914. So I take Troy's point absolutely that to blame one state for this is silly, especially since the people who were responsible in 1914 were all gone by 1918. And that's true not just in Germany, it's true in Austria, it's true in Russia, it's true in the Ottoman Empire. So that would be my quick answer.
Anyone else? Okay, next.
Hi. Before I start, thank you for having us today. I really appreciated it. But my question was, is any of the information you gave us today available online?
Lots of it. So a lot of the Connecticut-related stuff, we're doing, like I said, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and then on that website, ctandworldwar1.org. And we have a growing list of other resources. So one of the things we'll be publishing in the next week or two is a bibliography, a couple different kinds of bibliographies, of which Michael's book will be on, and Laura's. So that would be for Connecticut-related things, and some of the larger pictures, our website. And the National World War I Museum in Kansas City is another great resource, as is the United States World War I Centennial Commission site. So if you Google those, you can find them. And we have links to those on our website as well.
Thank you.
For those of you who are looking for a little more depth about Connecticut as well, right down the street, the Knights of Columbus Museum has the ongoing exhibit. It's free. You can go in any time during business hours and see their exhibit. It has lots of local connections in it if you're doing research on that as well. And I believe our Southern Connecticut State University Journalism Department, our website will be posting pictures from the event and the slides from today. Jack Mordente, veteran himself.
Hi, Jack Mordente. I'm coordinator of our Veterans and Military Affairs office here on campus.
So we learned today about the 17-year-old ambulance driver, and we learned that the average age of the World War II soldier was about 22. All of that changed when the Japanese bombed us at Pearl Harbor and we entered World War II. Thousands of 18, 19, 20-year-olds joined the military. We also had the draft, and when you turned 18, you were drafted. It continued with Korea, and then in Vietnam in '62, President Kennedy formed the Green Berets, and they went into Vietnam as advisors. And the same phenomenon occurred with our young 18, 19, 20-year-olds joining. And then we had the draft, and the only way you could avoid the draft is either for medical reasons, you continued in school, you had a student deferment, or in Vietnam's case, young men and women chose, or men chose to go to Canada. So I just wanted to emphasize the fact that the age of those of our young people who serve in war, and it's the 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. I recently flew out to the aircraft carrier Roosevelt, and one of the things that struck me, if some of you have seen on the flight deck, there's young men and women with the different color shirts. Some of them mount the bombs on the jets, and others are getting the jets prepared to take off. The men and women on that deck are 18 and 19 years old. An aircraft carrier is like a floating city. There's about 5,000 men and women there. I went up on the bridge. The young men and women driving that ship were 18 and 19, 20-year-olds. So I just wanted to make that comment to our young people in the audience who are 18 or 19, and those of you who are maybe going to be seniors and graduate. It will never change, this phenomenon about 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds wanting to join the military. It's just the way it is, and it'll continue. Thank you.
And I think that George's point was they're volunteers as well. So it's these were the people driving, the driving force behind both the military and the volunteerism. It's the teenagers that many of you are just about to be 17, 18, 19. Next question?
I'm sorry to bother you guys again, but
It's okay. There's no bother, that's why we're here.
It's okay.
But I just have a quick question. So you guys said about touring Southern earlier inside the presentation. So I was wondering, when do you guys do that? Do you guys do it in like the spring, the fall, the summer?
We had open house in the fall, but there's also a smaller one in the spring, and you can come during the week anytime and schedule an appointment to take a tour. They have a key days that you can come and tour. And when you do, tell President Joe you're coming, because he's serious about coming out of his office and seeing you.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Next question. Commercial break.
Hey everybody, thanks for coming. I'm aware of photos that show directly in the aftermath of World War I, everyday Germans burning their paper currency for heat and insulation due to the hyperinflation of the currency. And so I'm just wondering that given that context of decimation, hopelessness, and poverty, what role should a superpower or world power play in the domestic defense policy of a country in such a situation? And how do you navigate the intricacies of respecting their autonomy and also not creating a power vacuum for radicalism and nationalism?
If you have an answer to any of those questions, I have some people at the U.S. Army that would really love to talk to you.
The government wants your help.
Yeah, they're really complicated questions, and as you know, they're questions from a century ago, and they're questions that are in the media and in the news right now. So I think it's an incredibly difficult balance for any country to strike of when the internal affairs of another country are sufficiently threatening to itself that it feels it has to act. There are entire disciplines of history and international relations that deal with exactly this question. If I had an answer, I would gladly give it to you. And if you come up with one, like I said, please let me know.
And was the second fellow that you told us to pay mind to, it seemed as though his policy would be more isolationist?
Yeah, so isolationist to folks like Tasker Bliss didn't mean ignore the rest of the world. It meant don't tie yourself to international organizations or international treaties that you think are bad. So isolationists in America didn't think you could just ignore the outside world. What they believed is is that the United States and the world would be better if we didn't associate ourselves with the Europeans, with all of these terrible things that were coming out of Versailles. And that's a debate that, I mean, we still have it in the last presidential election where Secretary Clinton was arguing for the United States to be more involved in international organizations, and then candidate Trump arguing that the United States should be less involved in international organizations. And that's a debate that comes straight out of the First World War.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Sir?
One more. Schlieffen Plan, flawed strategy from the beginning, or was it possible to work?
Germanist?
I couldn't hear. Well, I'm going to punt this in one way and say that there actually is no such thing as a Schlieffen Plan. If you read the work of Terence Zuber, who's an retired American military officer who ended up getting a PhD in history in Württemberg, he argues that there was no such thing as a Schlieffen Plan. And so now the question you're asking is, the question Germany faces is how do you fight a two-front war? They have limited resources compared to their opposition. As a military strategy, I think it's a defensible military strategy. I don't think the Germans had a better alternative at the time.
Good morning. So I'm in the class of Professors Cindy and Jody, but I have a question for all the professionals up here, all the experts. One thing I have not come across in my readings and studies and a whole bunch of the other stuff that they're having us do is, and it kind of, it was brought up to me in the discussion that about Sykes-Picot and how there were, I think it was said that there were over 100 American prisoners, and also how Mr. D'Angelo just told us about Sergeant Early and Sergeant York taking German prisoners. How were prisoners, how were prisoners exchanged back to their original countries at the end of the war? How did that take place?
So it's really complicated, as everything with the First World War is. Most of the Allied prisoners are released first, because that's the terms of the armistice, that Allied prisoners have to be released. And then there is this process of repatriation. The problem is that as they're releasing these prisoners of war, the boundaries of the countries are literally changing. So you just can't release somebody back into the Austro-Hungarian Empire because there's no such political entity. So what they're trying to figure out is how do you identify where people ought to go? And eventually, for most of them, I think what they end up doing is just saying you're released from the prison camp, you go where you think it most appropriate that you belong. But there is a really complicated process of trying to figure out where these people ought to go back to. It's especially complicated for Jews who had lived in all three of the Eastern empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian, and now the borders are moving all over the place, and nobody quite knows where they ought to go. It's a similar problem that they'll have at the end of World War II, only it's concentration camp survivors, and they're trying to figure out where those people ought to go. So it's another one of these kind of poisoned apples that come off the tree of the First World War that create more problems.
I appreciate you asking the question because, in fact, I was curious when I was thinking about those men, and I never read any stories. I really relied on a local collection of newspapers to put my book together, which were clippings put together by the New Haven City librarians between 1916 and 1917, 1918. And that's really how I wrote my book, through the lens of what they thought was important. And I don't really recall anything coming up as to, let's interview this New Haven man who was a prisoner of war during World War I. I mean, that just doesn't seem like the kind of thing that folks maybe wanted to read about.
There were a number of Connecticut men that were taken prisoner. Louis Zegra, who was captured by German forces a couple days before Sykes-Picot, who was extensively interviewed when he came home, and there were lots of newspaper accounts. He spent most of the war in internment in German camps, and he went on to become a Connecticut legislator. And there's a colleague of ours, Terry Finnegan, is trying to get him a Medal of Honor because, I can't remember, von Gallwitz, I think it was, one of the German generals, when Zegra was taken prisoner, he apparently fought the Germans tooth and nail, killed several of them. And von Gallwitz had made mention that this American was one of the bravest soldiers he had ever seen. So, you know, there are great stories out there of them. You just have to know where to look. And as far as their release, I think most of the American prisoners were kept throughout the duration of the war, which really wasn't very long. It was about 6 months. So.
Thank you.
Last question.
A quick one. My father used to go to dinners for the last man standing of the Yankee division. I'd like to know if the last man was ever identified.
I would love to know too. That medal came through, so the son of John Dillon, it was John Dillon Jr., and he kept his father's materials in 2 cardboard boxes, never thought about his father's World War I materials until Christine started doing her work around the state and kind of put 2 and 2 together. So he himself, John Dillon Jr., doesn't really know too much more about the last man standing, and I'd love to know more about them too.
Frank Rivers, another New Haven soldier, was one of the last men. And it was actually a club, a monetary club. And the last man standing, they would each put in money every year, and the last man standing got that pot. So it was a prize you really didn't want to win. But I believe, I don't know that there is, I don't know that we figured out who the last man was. Frank Rivers is up there, though.
Thank you.
But when we figure it out, you'll see it in the news, because we'll make sure our journalist friends get some coverage for it.
I think he might have been the 7th.
Okay, I'd like to thank our panelists for being here today, and thank you. I'd like to add one last point from us. This is Veterans Day weekend. I come from a long family of veterans myself, and every year at Veterans Day, we always say to my brother, who's the last man standing in our family in the military, thank you for your service. And so please, this weekend, take time, stop a veteran, and thank them for their service. Take care.
Me too.